Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, just pop along to patreon.com/the History Network and find out about how to become a patron there. Thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, Season 32, Episode 5. Saladin. This episode was written by Ben Duval. Ben is a military historian and analyst who served over a decade in the US Marine Corps and Marine Reserve. His most recent book is Saladin the Strategist: How the Crusaders Lost the Holy Land, a history and analysis of Saladin's campaigns, available now on Amazon. He has also written Midway Through the Plunge, about 13 dark years in Byzantine history, which saw the empire's power irreversibly collapse, and has published a critical edition of F. L. Taylor's classic study of Renaissance warfare, The Art of War in Italy. You can find more of his writing on ByzantineEmporia.com and bazaarofwar.com. Ben can be found on Twitter under the handle Bazaar of War. On the 4th of July, 1187, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria, An-Nasir Yusuf Salah ad-Din ibn Ayyub, better known to us as Saladin, won a tremendous victory, one of the most famous of the Middle Ages. Beneath the Horns of Hattin, the twin peaks of an extinct volcano, his forces destroyed the largest army that the Crusader states ever fielded, killing or capturing the great majority of knights and foot soldiers. In a stroke, the kingdom of Jerusalem was left defenceless, and in the following months Saladin went on to capture most of its towns and castles, including Jerusalem itself. The following year he campaigned against the other states of the Latin East, leaving them small rumps which barely extended past their principal cities. Hattin was like an earthquake that left the Crusader states crippled, unable to take the initiative ever again. Although waves of counter-offensives arrived from Europe in the following decades and managed to recoup some of their losses, never again would the native Christian barons be a force of their own. The great irony of Saladin's victory is that he was not a brilliant battlefield commander. He was tactically competent and won several battles throughout his career, fighting against Christians and Muslims alike. But none of these were brilliant, and most were not terribly important. By 1187 he had reached the height of his power within the Islamic world, less through battlefield victories than through diplomacy and large-scale manoeuvres. Against the Crusaders his record was somewhat more checkered. How, then, did he manage not only a brilliant victory, but such a consequential one? The answer lies not with his tactics, but with his strategy, and to understand that, we have to look at the fraught world of Syrian politics. Saladin became an independent sovereign in 1174, the year that his lord Nur ad-Din, the powerful prince of Aleppo, died. Saladin had been serving as his viceroy in Egypt at the time, and in the chaos following his master's death, expanded his control into Syria. By this time the Crusaders and Muslims had already been fighting each other for 3/4 of a century, and regular patterns had emerged. Muslim armies of the region were built around a core of Turkish horse archers. Bands of these skilled marksmen rode up to enemy lines and poured arrows into their ranks before riding back to safety. If the opposing cavalry was so rash as to pursue, The Turks would usually retreat some distance to allow the enemy charge to become disordered and strung out, and then counter-attack. The rest of these armies were composed of infantry and lancers who would charge enemy ranks when they were wavering. If Muslim tactics were dictated primarily by horse archery, then Crusader tactics were formed around the heavily armoured knight, whose thunderous charges could shatter all but the most solid formations. Western heavy cavalry had more trouble against their fleet-footed Turkish opponents, however, who would disperse like a cloud of vapours at their approach. Bitter experience taught the knights not to go charging off too far, lest they get caught in a feigned retreat and surrounded. This forced them to exercise extreme patience. Typically, Christian infantry formed a wall to protect the horses from arrows, as their own crossbowmen returned fire. When the moment was right, when the enemy grew too confident or lost its discipline, the knights passed through the lines of infantry and launched a devastating charge. These dynamics made it difficult for either side to defeat the other outright. If both sides exercised discipline and avoided major errors, neither could land a decisive blow. Over time, the Crusaders worked this into a strategy that played to their strengths while mitigating their weaknesses. They constructed a number of strong castles throughout their lands which slowed down invading forces and allowed the Christians to muster in safety. They could then ride out and intercept the attackers, eventually either bringing them to battle on favourable terms or forcing a stalemate by taking up a strong position and refusing battle until enemy provisions were exhausted. This was a great frustration for the Muslim powers, who went to great efforts to summon armies for seasonal campaigns, but often came away empty-handed, despite outnumbering their foes. This strategy was only possible because the Crusader states controlled the entire eastern shore of the Mediterranean. They could receive supplies and reinforcements by sea, carried in Venetian, Genoese, and Pisan ships. By remaining on the defensive most of the time, the Crusaders could periodically go on the offensive when reinforced by large expeditions of armed pilgrims from Europe. In 1148, the Second Crusade joined the barons of Palestine in an attempt on Damascus, for example, and the kings of Jerusalem made several expeditions to conquer Egypt. The latter was especially dangerous for the neighbouring Muslim powers. If the Christians captured Egypt, they would have its enormous resources at their disposal. The rich farmlands of the Nile would make attractive fiefs for the disinherited second sons of Europe and draw even more fighting strength to the east. If Egypt were united with Syria under Muslim rule, on the other hand, it could be used to squeeze the Crusader states from two directions. Both sides, therefore, had strong offensive and defensive reasons to control it. The crisis came to a head in the 1160s when the tottering Fatimid dynasty of Egypt appeared to be on its last legs. It was around this time that Saladin enters the pages of history. The young Kurdish noble was in the service of Nur ad-Din, the Prince of Aleppo and ruler of Syria. Following the Crusaders' first incursion into Egypt, Nur ad-Din sent expeditions of his own to bring Cairo into his orbit. These were commanded by Saladin's uncle Shirkuh, who brought his nephew along to gain valuable experience. The first two expeditions failed when the Egyptians called the Crusaders to their aid, but this also revealed the weakness of their rule. Sensing as much, the Crusaders launched another invasion of their own in the autumn of 1168, hoping for a swift victory. The Egyptians now turned to Nur ad-Din for help, who sent Shirkuh and Saladin racing across the desert to the Nile. When they arrived early in 1169, the Crusaders immediately withdrew, and Shirkuh effectively took power in Cairo in Nur ad-Din's name. Then, 2 months later, he died, leaving Saladin in command. It was a strange twist of fate. At the age of 31, Saladin had become the de facto ruler of one of the richest states in the Muslim world. He maintained an uneasy working relationship with Nur ad-Din for the next 5 years, but was in many ways an independent sovereign. When his overlord died in 1174, he became fully independent. Nur ad-Din's heir was a boy of just 11, and all his vassals and neighbours rushed to exploit his weakness. Saladin was no exception. He raced to Damascus, where the local aristocracy submitted to his rule, then pressed northward. He spent the next 2 years at war with rival Muslim powers, and by 1176 secured the title of Sultan over an impressive empire which stretched from Egypt to central Syria. Next, he turned his attention toward the Crusaders. Saladin launched his first major campaign against the Kingdom of Jerusalem in 1177. He could finally fulfill Nur ad-Din's dream of combining the strength of Syria and Egypt against them. He assembled a large army outside Cairo, then marched up the coast. After bypassing pockets of enemy soldiers at Gaza and Ascalon, he set his men loose upon the land, allowing them to sack and pillage as he advanced with his main force to besiege towns. But the Crusaders were undeterred. Several hundred knights and many more infantry shadowed the invading column and struck the vanguard as the army was crossing a flooded stream near a place called Montgizard. Saladin desperately scrambled to put his men in fighting order and bring the rest of the troops forward, but the Crusaders' furious charge hit them before they could form their ranks. The vanguard was completely routed, and the rest of the army crumbled at the sight, fleeing in complete disorder. The Christians aggressively pursued and inflicted heavy casualties. Although most of the army made it back across the desert to Egypt, the Battle of Montgizard was a painful but necessary lesson for Saladin. The Christian knights were not to be underestimated, even when greatly outnumbered. The chastened Sultan was able to avenge this defeat in 1179. He had learnt 2 major lessons from this earlier disaster. He needed to plan his campaigns much more carefully and to invade from Syria rather than Egypt. The Golan Heights on the east bank of the River Jordan were an ideal assembly area, fertile enough to sustain tens of thousands of troops at a time. This stood in contrast to the Sinai frontier, which entailed a desert crossing that made logistics difficult and proved dangerous in the event of a reverse. The King of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV, realized as much and constructed a powerful castle on the upper reaches of the Jordan at a place called Jacob's Ford. The fortress blocked one of the major crossings of the river and posed a danger to any army which might try to bypass it. It also served as a potential launching pad for any Crusader attempt to capture the Golan. It could not be allowed to stand. This forced Saladin to take a much more cautious approach in his next campaign. After assembling a large army on the eastern bank of the Jordan in June 1179, he sent raiding parties through Galilee as far as the coast, hoping to bait the Crusaders into some rash action. Baldwin was aware of the danger that the main Muslim army posed, so he gathered a sizable force of cavalry and infantry and travelled by a roundabout route over the hills of Galilee, then fell upon a raiding party as it was returning to camp. The raiders were handily beaten and fled, with the knights on their heels in a disorderly pursuit. The infantry, exhausted from the fast and difficult march, took the occasion to rest. Saladin's main army was alerted, however, and rode out to aid their comrades. They mauled Baldwin's men, who were scattered across the battlefield, and the king himself barely escaped with his life. As the Christians licked their wounds from this defeat, Saladin called up reinforcements from other parts of the frontier. In August his army appeared before the castle at Jacob's Ford. His efficient sappers immediately set to undermining the walls, and within days they made a breach. Baldwin marched out at the head of the relief army, but the castle fell before he could arrive. Saladin razed it to the ground and led the surviving garrison off into captivity. Saladin's twin victories avenged his earlier humiliation and secured the frontier. The Christians soon agreed to a several-year truce, allowing the Sultan to turn his attention to other projects. The peace lasted until the end of 1181, when the faithless robber baron Renaud de Chatillon plundered a Muslim caravan. Every year from 1182 to 1184, Saladin launched a major invasion of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. This was a crucial period, during which he refined a campaign strategy that would lead him to ultimate victory at Hattin. The previous campaign had showed Saladin a new way forward. He could make material gains against the Crusader states only by beating their armies in the field first. In order to do that, he needed to bait them into action on favourable terms. In the spring of 1182, Saladin travelled from Cairo to Damascus with a considerable force. He pillaged Renaud's holdings east of the Dead Sea along the way, then assembled the combined might of Syria and Egypt in the Golan. Once again he sent raiding parties into Palestine, both to pillage the summer harvest and to reconnoitre the landscape. He then crossed the Jordan and followed the river south to the town of Bethsan, which he sacked. Bethsan stood at the end of a valley which led to the coastal plain, putting the valuable region in danger. The Crusaders hastily assembled their forces and rushed down the Jordan in pursuit, managing to intercept the Muslim army before it could advance westward. The ensuing battle followed true to form. Saladin's men assailed the Christian host from all sides, but the Crusaders maintained their composure. Crossbowmen returned fire, and groups of knights periodically charged out in short, disciplined bursts. At the end of the day, neither side had won, despite high casualties on both sides. The large number of men present had exhausted the provisions in the countryside, however, forcing the Muslims to withdraw. Although Saladin was unable to destroy the Christian field army, this was not, in fact, his primary objective. The Egyptian fleet was scheduled to sail north in August for an attack on Beirut, so the Sultan travelled north to the Bekaa Valley to wait for it. When lookouts spotted the ships on the horizon, he crossed the mountains and besieged Beirut by land and sea. At the same time, raiding parties crossed the Sinai from Egypt and descended on Palestine from the Golan Heights. Reports of these incursions created a confused picture among Christians, who remained paralyzed for several days, but it soon became clear that Saladin's main thrust was towards Beirut. They scrambled to get the army and navy ready to move north. Beirut was meanwhile putting up stronger than expected resistance. Saladin had not brought his siege engines across the mountains in the interest of speed and surprise. After initial attempts at mining the walls failed, his only remaining option was to attempt a frontal assault by escalade. This was bound to be bloody, and he was reluctant to try. So, when he received news that the Christian army and fleet were on their way, he withdrew rather than risk getting trapped along the narrow coast. Although the campaign was a failure, it showed that Saladin had absorbed the lesson of his prior success. He deliberately provoked a fight to keep the Christian army tied up in the south, then made a lightning dash to strike in the north. Had it been successful, Beirut would have split Crusader territory in two and broken their chokehold on the coast. It was in a very defensible position, difficult to approach from other directions, and could have been used as a launch pad for subsequent campaigns. The plan was also inherently flexible. If Saladin had managed to destroy the Crusader army in Galilee, all of Palestine would have been open to him, and he could have redirected his fleet to move against other objectives on the coast. As it happened, however, even this was not Saladin's primary objective for 1182. Nur ad-Din's sole heir had recently died, which put the inheritance of Aleppo, the great city of northern Syria, in contention. Saladin spent the following autumn and spring campaigning against rival Muslim princes, and in June 1183 finally gained possession of Aleppo. This brought all of Syria under his control and put him in an excellent position to renew the war against the Christians. Saladin began his campaign of 1183 just as he had the year before. He crossed the Jordan by the Sea of Galilee, marched south down the Jordan Valley, then turned west around Bethsan. This time the Crusaders were also better prepared. They managed to occupy and entrench a spring, allowing them to hold out indefinitely. The two sides skirmished inconclusively for a week, but when it became apparent to Saladin that he would not be able to draw his enemy into a decisive battle, he pillaged parts of Galilee before recrossing the Jordan. He was not done, however. Having tied down the Christian army, he followed the pattern of his two previous campaigns and besieged another target. This time his objective was the impressive fortress of Kerak, which stood east of the Dead Sea along the desert route between Egypt and Syria. It was a possession of Renaud de Chatillon, the same knight who had rekindled the war by attacking a caravan. So long as it remained in his hands, even military convoys could be threatened during the hazardous desert crossing. Saladin brought up all his siege equipment against the fortress and was making good progress when a relief army appeared. He was not prepared to fight an open field battle, so he abandoned the siege, withdrawing to Damascus. Yet again, failure showed Saladin the path forward for his next campaign. He had not been successful either in destroying the Crusader field army or in taking his alternative objective. What if, instead of using a field action to open the path to a siege, he did the opposite, use a siege to precipitate a battle? Accordingly, in 1184, he reversed the itinerary of the previous year. He picked up the siege of Kerak where he had left off, and after some time his scouts reported that a relief army was on its way. He rushed out to meet it, but the Christians managed to slip by him in the night and reach Kerak. He missed his chance both to win a field engagement and to take the fortress. Palestine was left mostly undefended, however, so he sent his forces across the Jordan once more to pillage before retiring for the season. It might seem that after 3 failed campaigns in a row, Saladin had hit a wall. He was unable to make any progress against the Crusaders, who cleverly manoeuvred and put their strengths to good use. Their ranks were too disciplined and their castles too sturdy. Yet were these really failures? They were of some slight military use, wearing down the enemy and pillaging his lands. They also gave Saladin valuable experience, allowing him to exercise his generalship, gain familiarity with the Christians' fighting style, and learn the lay of the land in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Most important of all, they allowed him to experiment and refine his strategy. Although Saladin's campaign of 1184 did not succeed, his failure was more of execution than of concept. It was the same concept that brought him victory at Hattin 3 years later, when he besieged Tiberias to draw the Crusaders into battle on ground of his choosing. When he finally stood triumphant over the shattered Christian army, it was less the fruit of brilliant tactics than of a strategy 10 years in the making. For more on the Battle of Hattin, listen to our History Network Season 21, Episode 10 podcast. For more on Saladin's campaigns, and the evolution of his strategy, check out Saladin the Strategist, How the Crusaders Lost the Holy Land, available on Amazon and written by Ben Duval. Well, thanks, Ben, for writing that episode for us. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, then pop along to patreon.com/The History Network. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Ben Duval, read by Nick Barker.